8 men are sitting in Iranian custody right now. Their names are on a screen, their ranks are confirmed, their unit designations, Delta Force, are published for the entire world to read. Iranian state media organize those photographs the way you'd organize a legal brief, methodical, clinical, deliberate, and when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps spokesperson stepped in front of the cameras, he did not issue a military communique. He delivered 5 words that cut straight through every official press briefing Washington has been constructing for weeks. Iran, he said, is not Venezuela. Hold that sentence in place for a moment because it matters more than anything else that's been said publicly about this conflict. That statement is not a taunt. It is not propaganda for domestic consumption. It is a precisely calibrated geopolitical message, delivered at the exact moment when the scale of American losses in this war is becoming impossible to manage through official channels. Iran is telling Washington, and through Washington the entire world, that this theater operates by different rules. There will be no 30-minute extraction. There will be no head of state in handcuffs on an aircraft carrier. What there will be is American soldiers photographed in custody, their identities confirmed, their capture serving as the most tangible proof yet that something in the strategic architecture of this war has gone catastrophically wrong. And the question that none of the press briefings, none of the flag-draped rhetoric, and none of the official statements have yet answered honestly is this: how did the most powerful military alliance in modern history arrive at a war whose boundaries no one controls, whose costs no one agreed to pay, and whose purpose, when you examine it carefully, begins to look very different from what the public was told? To answer that question honestly, you can't start in February of 2026 when the bombs fell. You can't even start on October 7th, 2023. You have to go back further, to something that was happening every single month quietly through a financial mechanism that almost nobody in official Washington wanted to examine too closely. And what you find when you look is one of the most staggering contradictions in modern geopolitical history. The suitcases. No one mentioned every month. Suitcases filled with United States dollars arrived in Gaza. Not smuggled currency. Not darkroom transactions between adversaries. These transfers happened with the knowledge of the Israeli government. They were routed through Qatar, and the receiving party was Hamas, the organization that Israel and the United States had jointly designated as a terrorist group. The very organization whose existence is the stated justification for a war that has now captured American soldiers, drawn Yemen into formal combat, shut down the world's most critical maritime corridor, and sent energy prices into historic territory across every continent on Earth. According to investigators who traced the financial architecture of this arrangement, the transfers reached approximately $35 million per month during peak periods, totaling more than $1 billion over the years they were sustained. The delivery mechanism was deliberately analog: physical suitcases, American currency, routed through Qatar's financial system. Israeli intelligence officers reportedly escorted the Qatari officials making the deliveries. There was nothing covert about it from the Israeli government's perspective. It was policy, managed, authorized, and signed off at the highest level. And here is the detail that strips away any remaining ambiguity about who knew what. Qatar, anticipating that Netanyahu would eventually deny authorizing the payments, required him to put his requests in writing. Qatar knew him well enough to demand a paper trail. They weren't protecting themselves from some bureaucratic misunderstanding. They were protecting themselves from a leader they expected to lie. And they were right to expect it, because that paper trail now exists, and investigators examining it in connection with Netanyahu's ongoing corruption prosecution have described what it documents in terms that are almost impossible to read without stopping. But there's something even more disturbing than the transfers themselves. In 2019, Shin Bet director Nadav Argaman warned Netanyahu directly and in writing that Hamas military chief Mohammed Deif was siphoning off $4 million a month from the Qatari funds for the military wing. Military intelligence followed with its own assessment confirming the same thing. Netanyahu's reported response was 3 words: "I've heard, we'll continue." The transfers kept flowing. The organizational infrastructure of Hamas, its command structure, its administrative network, its operational capacity, stayed intact. And it stayed intact for years. Divide and keep divided. The strategic logic, reconstructed from available evidence and from reported statements Netanyahu made to investigators in his own corruption case, works like this. For decades, the single greatest threat to Israel's ability to define Palestinian political reality on its own terms was not Hamas. It was a unified Palestinian political body capable of presenting a coherent, internationally recognized demand for a state. Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank represented a permanent fracture in Palestinian political authority. 2 factions, mutually hostile, institutionally incompatible. As long as that division persisted, Palestinian political unity was structurally impossible. And as long as Hamas remained in control of Gaza, Israel always had an argument it could deploy on any international stage at any moment. It cannot negotiate with a party that refuses to recognize its existence and fires rockets at its civilians. That argument is strategically bulletproof. And it only works if Hamas stays in power. Netanyahu reportedly described his approach in terms that were blunt enough to leave the investigators he was speaking to visibly unsettled. I'm constantly passing them messages. I confuse them, mislead them, lie to them, and then hit them. That framing, documented in investigators' records tied to his prosecution, was not a description of some rogue operation. It was a description of deliberate strategic management. Keep Gaza under Hamas, keep the West Bank under Fatah, ensure the Palestinians remain divided, ensure they can never present a unified political front, and use Qatari cash as the mechanism that keeps the whole architecture running without fingerprints. But here is where the contradiction becomes structurally enormous, and where it stops being just an Israeli political scandal and becomes something that affects every country now drawn into this conflict. Because this is the same Benjamin Netanyahu who stood before the United States Congress and received standing ovations for calling Hamas an existential threat to civilization, who built the public case for Operation Epic Fury around the premise that destroying Hamas and its Iranian backers was a moral and strategic imperative that Washington could not afford to refuse. The public argument and the documented practice were not simply different, they were inverted. The stated enemy was the funded party. The humanitarian catastrophe used to justify the war was administered by an organization kept alive with cash flowing through the same financial system that everyone claimed to be fighting, and the government making the public case for war was, according to investigators, the same government that authorized the financial mechanism keeping that organization functional for years. What October 7th actually required. October 7th, 2023 was not the product of a well-supplied military force at the peak of its capability. It was the product of an organization that had survived precisely because the economic constraints it operated under were periodically relieved by transfers designed to keep it functionally alive. The difference matters. A movement at its peak capability is one thing. A movement that has been kept on life support, just capable enough to sustain itself, just desperate enough to attempt something catastrophic, is something else entirely. The families of the Israeli victims of October 7th deserve a complete accounting. Not an accounting that begins on October 6th, a complete accounting that traces the financial and strategic decisions back to their origin points, and asks seriously whether the architecture built in the name of security actually served the security it claimed to protect. Because what those families got instead of answers was a political and emotional environment in which any questioning of the war's strategic foundation was immediately characterized as support for the attackers. The public space for asking hard questions was compressed to near zero, and into that compressed space, an operation was launched. Its public justification was framed around October 7th, and that framing carried enormous moral weight, because October 7th was a genuine catastrophe, a legitimate security crisis that produced real grief and real loss on a scale that no serious person disputes. But moral weight and strategic clarity are not the same thing. A war can have a morally defensible origin and still be designed by people whose actual interests diverge from the stated objectives. And the question of whether that divergence exists here is the question that the evidence, examined honestly, is forcing into view. February 28, 2026. Operation Epic Fury. At 1:15 in the morning on February 28, 2026, US and partner forces began striking targets across Iran. The objectives, as stated publicly, were specific. Obliterate Iran's ballistic missile arsenal and production capacity, eliminate the Iranian Navy, sever its support for proxy organizations, and ensure Iran could never acquire a nuclear weapon. Within the opening hours, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. US Central Command began releasing strike metrics that painted a picture of overwhelming operational effectiveness. Over 5,500 targets struck, entire classes of Iranian warships eliminated, drone and missile attack rates from Iranian forces dropped dramatically. Admiral Brad Cooper, speaking as CENTCOM commander, described Iranian combat power as declining, while American combat power built steadily. He acknowledged 50,000 deployed service members and offered prayers for the fallen and wounded, numbers that told a story the briefing metrics were not designed to emphasize, because even within an operation described as precision-dominant and technologically superior, people were dying, and the question of what those deaths were purchasing, strategically speaking, was not addressed in the briefings. What the briefings also did not address was the full picture of what was happening to the waterways. Because whatever was being achieved in the skies over Iran, something very different was happening at sea. Iran's response was not primarily in the air, it was in the water, and the consequences of that response were not measured in strike sorties or battle damage assessments. They were measured in what every household on Earth paid for energy the following week. The waterways are the actual weapon. The Strait of Hormuz is 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Approximately 30% of the world's seaborne crude oil trade moves through that passage. 20% of global liquefied natural gas supply follows the same route. These are not abstract statistics. They are the physical geography of the global energy system, and Iran has operated inside that geography for decades, developing the asymmetric capabilities specifically designed to make that passage costly for any party attempting to use it as a military theater. The mines Iranian forces placed in the strait were not primarily targeting American naval destroyers with sophisticated countermeasure systems. They were targeting tanker captains, the civilian operators who must decide every single day whether any cargo value justifies the risk of sailing into a mined and contested waterway. And those captains stopped sailing. Brent crude surged 10 to 13% in the opening days, reaching the low 80s almost immediately. Then the strait officially closed, and on March 4, 2026, Brent crude crossed $120 per barrel. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all export contracts. That last development triggered the second hammer. Qatar produces a staggering share of the world's liquefied natural gas. When Qatar Energy announced it was halting LNG production because tankers could not safely leave the Gulf, European natural gas prices jumped 66% in a single week. For European households still managing the energy cost pressure inherited from the post-Russia supply disruption, that number was not a market statistic. It was a bill that arrived without warning, for a war they did not vote for, fought over resources they do not control, triggered by strategic decisions made in rooms they were never invited into. The International Energy Agency described it as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. And the food price consequences, running through disrupted Gulf fertilizer production, were already loaded into a 4 to 6 month delay that officials would eventually attribute to market forces, carefully avoiding any description of the decision chain that produced them. The Houthis and the IRGC did not randomly choose these waterways. They chose them because the mathematical relationship between waterway disruption and global economic pressure is precise and measurable. Every dollar of Brent crude above $100 is a direct political problem for the American administration that ran on lower energy prices as a central campaign promise. Every week that European households absorb a 66% gas price spike is a week that the political cost of continuing the operation rises for every allied government involved. This is not collateral damage. This is deliberately designed economic exhaustion, and the parties executing it understood exactly what they were doing. Yemen joins, and then Saudi Arabia. On March 19th and 20th, 2026, Houthi military spokesperson Yahya Saraya issued what was not a warning. It was a declaration. Yemeni forces would join the fight against the United States and Israel. American warships in the Red Sea were now targets. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through which roughly $1 trillion worth of goods passes annually, was under threat of complete blockage. The Houthis had been firing at commercial and military shipping since the early weeks of the Gaza campaign. But this was different. This was a formal declaration of belligerency, and formal declarations changed the structure of the conflict. They closed diplomatic off-ramps. They raised the domestic political cost of any settlement pursued before the declared objectives are achieved. They make every subsequent negotiation harder, because now there is a party at the table whose political survival depends on the war continuing. On March 28, 2026, the Houthis followed through with their first ballistic missile strikes on Israel since Operation Epic Fury began, targeting what they described as sensitive military sites and vowing to continue until the aggression on all resistance fronts stops. They explicitly warned Bahrain and the UAE, the two Arab states reportedly considering joining the Strait of Hormuz campaign, that they will be the first to lose in this battle. The message was not subtle. Join the coalition and your own infrastructure becomes a target. And then there was Saudi Arabia. The kingdom had been absorbing Iranian missile and drone strikes on its own infrastructure as a direct consequence of hosting American military assets, strikes that were already hammering its economy before the war officially started. The Ras Tanura refinery, one of the most significant petroleum processing complexes on Earth, was hit. Saudi stock markets collapsed in the opening weeks. The kingdom was absorbing the costs of a war it did not initiate, did not approve, and reports suggest was never consulted about before the decision was made. If Saudi Arabia's reported movement toward coalition alignment is confirmed, the entire architecture of this conflict transforms. A US and Israel operation becomes something categorically different the moment an Arab Gulf state formally joins it. Every other Arab state watching that alignment makes a calculation about its own position. Every population in the Arab world absorbs the information that its own government has sided with the parties conducting strikes on an Islamic republic. Every diplomatic relationship in the region is repriced against that single fact. That is not a contained regional operation. That is a transformation. And transformations of this scale do not end quickly, do not end cheaply, and do not end without producing political consequences that outlast every justification offered at the beginning. The Qatar contradiction. Here is where the architecture of this conflict produces what may be its most staggering single contradiction. And it involves the country that every party in this conflict, the United States, Israel, Hamas, Iran, and the Houthis, has been depending on simultaneously in ways that should have been impossible to reconcile. Qatar routed $35 million per month to Hamas. Qatar also hosts the largest American airbase in the Middle East. Qatar served as the sole diplomatic channel through which American negotiators attempted to reach Hamas during hostage negotiations. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports function as the energy lifeline of Europe, and Qatar's sovereign wealth fund invested in financial entities connected to prominent American political networks during the same period the transfers were occurring. This is not a contradiction that appeared after the war began. It existed throughout the entire pre-war period. During every public declaration about stopping terrorist financing, during every congressional testimony about Gulf money reaching militant organizations, during every strategic planning session in which this conflict was designed. The argument made internally, as documented by multiple Israeli journalists and confirmed in government testimony, was that allowing Hamas minimal administrative function prevented a total collapse of governance in Gaza that would produce an outcome even more difficult to manage. That argument was apparently convincing enough to override the Shin Bet director's written warning, the military intelligence assessment, and common strategic sense, and Qatar knew. Qatar required a written request because they understood they were doing business with a party who would deny everything later. They protected themselves. The question is who protected the soldiers now sitting in Iranian custody. The question is who protected the tanker captains who had to stop sailing. The question is who protected the European families now looking at a 66% gas bill. The answer, based on the available record, is nobody. Because nobody with the authority to examine this architecture publicly had the political incentive to do so while it was still functioning. 8 men in photographs. The 8 men photographed in Iranian custody are on average in their mid-30s. Their faces are clear in the images, their names are confirmed, their unit designations, Delta Force, are publicly attributed. Iranian state media organized the release with the precision of a legal evidentiary brief, not a propaganda exercise. And the IRGC spokesperson explicitly stated this was not the first time American special operations personnel had been captured in the Strait. He referenced Venezuela. He said 5 words, "Iran is not Venezuela." The reference to Venezuela matters because in January of 2026, the United States deployed military force to extract a foreign head of state from his own country. The world read that operation not as a law enforcement action, but as a declaration that the rules governing sovereign immunity had been revised, unilaterally, without consultation. Iran absorbed that message and is now explicitly invoking it. You do not have the operational freedom in our theater that you demonstrated in Caracas. Your soldiers are in our custody. That is the operational reality, not the press release, not the briefing, the operational reality. For the families of those operators, this is not geopolitical analysis. It is their son, their husband, their brother, photographed in Iranian custody, his name and rank visible on a screen viewed by millions of people before the American government confirmed the situation existed. The human cost of strategic miscalculation does not remain in the conference room. It arrives at the door. It arrives in a phone call. It arrives in the kind of silence that no official statement, however carefully worded, has ever been able to fill. What were those men doing in the Strait of Hormuz in sufficient numbers to produce a capture incident of this scale? The strait is 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. The presence of American Special Operations Forces in that environment, at this scale, was either a planned operation that went wrong or an intelligence failure that left a significant unit exposed. Either answer raises serious questions about the operational planning behind the American military commitment in this theater. Questions that deserve answers that are not press briefings. Who benefits when it never ends? The question that the captured photographs, the Houthi declaration, the Saudi alignment reports, and the Qatari transfer records all point toward is not being asked clearly in any official forum. But it's the question that explains the architecture of everything you've just read. Who benefits from a permanent state of conflict in this region? Not who benefits from winning it. Who benefits from it continuing? Benjamin Netanyahu is facing criminal prosecution in Israeli courts on corruption charges that predate this war. The charges are serious. Prosecutors allege regulatory favors worth approximately $500 million in exchange for favorable media coverage. The war and the emergency legal framework that accompanies wartime governance has produced a political environment in which those proceedings cannot operate at normal pace. An Israeli prime minister convicted of corruption charges is a very different political figure from an Israeli prime minister leading what is framed as a war of national survival. One of those narratives destroys a political career. The other preserves it indefinitely. Qatar, which routed the transfers, also hosts American air bases, served as the diplomatic hostage negotiation channel, and has financial entanglements with American political and investment networks extensive enough to make aggressive official examination politically complicated for the parties who would need to conduct it. The reason Qatar has not received the scrutiny its institutional position in this conflict demands is not a mystery. It is a function of financial entanglement. The same mechanism that made Qatar indispensable also made it untouchable. This is how hidden strategic architectures operate. They do not announce themselves. They operate through layers of plausible justification, legitimate institutional relationships, and carefully managed information environments. The funding transfers were real, explained as conflict management tools. The diplomatic relationship with Qatar was maintained because of energy and military utility. The war was justified on the basis of exactly the threat that the same architecture was simultaneously financing. And when the logic was finally set in motion, the consequences expanded beyond any planning horizon that the planners publicly acknowledged. Operation Epic Fury is producing the outcomes that the planners of any serious regional war game would have projected. Iran retaliates at scale. Yemen enters formally. American soldiers are captured. Saudi Arabia is pulled toward coalition alignment. Every military asset positioned elsewhere in the world is being considered for redeployment toward this theater. Every alliance relationship Washington has been cultivating in the Indo-Pacific is being tested by the question of whether American strategic capacity is already fully committed in the Gulf. The bill nobody signed. The American soldiers in Iranian custody did not design the financial architecture that kept Hamas alive for a decade. The Yemeni civilians caught between Houthi governance and American retaliatory strikes did not authorize the transfers that flowed from Qatar to Gaza. The European households paying 66% more for natural gas this week did not sign off on an operation that closed the world's most important energy corridor. And the families of the thousands of people who have died in this conflict on every side in every country did not receive a full accounting of the strategic logic that determined their fate before that logic was set in motion. The Strait of Hormuz carries 30% of the world's seaborne crude oil. The Red Sea corridor, now threatened by Houthi closure of the Bab el-Mandeb, carries roughly $1 trillion in goods annually. The simultaneous weaponization of both corridors is not an accident of geography. It is the execution of a strategy by parties that studied the mathematical relationship between waterway disruption and economic pain for years before firing a single shot. They know exactly what the bill looks like. The people paying it are only now finding out. When the historians assemble what is being documented in real time right now, the central contradiction will be unavoidable. A war publicly justified by the need to destroy a terrorist organization that was being funded through a traceable financial mechanism by the same government that led the military campaign to destroy it. That contradiction does not appear in official statements, it does not appear in congressional testimony, it does not appear in the press briefings where spokespeople describe operational progress in terms designed to present a coherent strategic narrative. But it appears in the documents, it appears in the investigators' records, it appears in the transfer amounts and the routing accounts and the suitcases filled with US dollars that arrived in Gaza month after month, year after year, before the first rocket of October 7th was ever loaded into its tube. And it appears in the faces of those men photographed in Iranian custody, whose names and ranks are now known to the entire world, whether their government confirmed it or not. The question is not whether the war is happening. Everybody can see that it is. The question is whether the people dying in it were ever told the truth about why it started. And if the answer is no, then the deeper question every citizen of every country now paying this bill must eventually face is the one that has no comfortable answer. When wars are designed by those who benefit from their continuation and paid for by those who had no voice in the decision, who decides when they end? And more importantly, whoever actually wanted them to?